I was looking at the success rates of Napoleon in land battles on the European continent, right? So that's his core. He's just got totally epic hit rates, right? Like he's winning 80 to 100% of everything, every battle he gets into. And what I wanted to understand is how does he achieve these rates, right? He made sure he got the best people on his team. If you see how he goes about every battle, so he arrives, before the battle starts. He understands the battleground. He thinks through what his opponents might do. So he's thinking from first principles about the entire system of the battlefield in which he's operating, right? And he's looking for these, these non-linearity, these asymmetries, these unique unfair advantages, etc. And so he's looking for those. And then when the battle actually happens, it's like he just destroys them because they're busy in their own sort of usual best practices and mechanisms of doing things, and they're not looking at every battle as a separate opportunity to do something amazing and to win. And or in today's corporate speak, it wasn't a bunch of tasks to be executed, right? What he was communicating was intent. So he was saying, look, this is our goal, and these are the constraints within which we're operating, and all of that. And so he would communicate that to all his troops through a very interesting mechanism. So he made sure that on his general staff he had an old, illiterate foot soldier, and all three adjectives are important. And every order would be first read out to this guy, and if this guy nodded, and then Napoleon would ensure he explained it back, and he explained it back the way Napoleon wanted him to understand it. Only then would this order go out, would that order be ready for the battlefield. No one on the battlefield gives you a set of tasks or orders. Everyone is leading with intent. And such a powerful way, and if the militaries around the world can do it, they're the largest organizations at an insane scale and with very high stakes. Why don't you use it too, right, to align your teams within your company?
Welcome to Talking Billions. We talk about big ideas, big inspirations, big topics. We take on the hardest topic of all, money. How to make it, save it, keep it. But our conversations lead us to an even bigger question, what it means to live a rich life beyond money. My guests share their practices, principles, and evergreen wisdom. I'm your host, Bogumil Baranowski, author, TEDx speaker, and investment advisor to wealth creators with patient capital and an infinite investment horizon. I work with families and individuals who aspire to grow wealth over a lifetime and generations through disciplined, thoughtful investments in durable quality businesses while giving money meaning. Join me on this quest to unearth and share the wisdom of the ages. Let me share with you the podcast program disclosure statement. Blue Infinitas Capital LLC is a registered investment advisor, and the opinions expressed by the firm's employees and podcast guests on the show are their own and do not reflect the opinions of Blue Infinitas Capital. All the statements and opinions expressed are based upon information considered reliable, although it should not be relied upon as such. Any statements or opinions are subject to change without notice. The information presented is for educational purposes only and does not intend to make an offer or solicitation for the sale or purchase of any specific securities, investments, or investment strategies. Investments involve risk and, unless otherwise stated, are not guaranteed. The information expressed does not take into account your specific situation or objectives and is not intended as recommendations appropriate for any individual. Listeners are encouraged to seek advice from a qualified tax, legal, or investment advisor to determine whether any information presented may be suitable for their specific situation. Past performance is not indicative of future performance. None of what you're about to hear is investment advice. Right, my guest today is RItavan, best-selling author of Data Impact and expert in data-driven transformation. He shows how to unlock real value through purposeful data leverage rather than chasing trends like AI or cloud technology. RItavan reveals how legacy companies often fall into the trap of technology commoditization and shares strategies to use data for outsized returns, prioritizes high-impact tasks like dynamic pricing, avoid wasteful tech adoption, and focus on true differentiation. How are you? So nice to see you.
Great to be here, Bogumil. I enjoy watching your podcast, and yeah, it's nice to be here.
Well, I told you I've been looking forward to chatting with you. We connected a while ago. You were kind enough to share your book with me, which I read and loved and took so many notes that I had the hardest time to narrow it down to a handful of questions so that we can capture it all in 1 hour. I do have to ask you about your name. We spoke about it briefly. I know a little bit. I have an unusual name, but look at you. Tell me about your name.
Yeah, well, so as I was telling you, I just have one name, RItavan, which is kind of rare. Um, and there is kind of an idealism and story behind this. And so to keep it super brief, right? Like it's good to think from first principles and understand why you have first and last names around the world, right? And my understanding is that this was when you had nation states and centralization of taxation, you needed to keep record. So you would have been Bogomil, son of whoever in your village, 500, 600 years ago, and no one would have needed to know your last name because everyone knew everyone. And so if you had local tax collection, right, where the local, lord came by on the horse and sort of took the stuff, you didn't need to identify everyone, with some sort of, unique identifier. And when you had national level taxation, suddenly that became important. If you look at last names around the world, they very often have location-based, family names. So, it's be Bogumil from village XYZ, right? Or profession-based. So it's going to be Bogumil, the miller, right? You because you have a mill, or whatever, the farmer, and these very special. I mean, I know this in German. You have this in French. You have it in English. So what happened was in India that when sort of this first name last name system sort of got standardized in colonial times, what it led to is greater. I mean, every society discriminates to some level, and the association between your sort of hereditary relatives, kind of your family tree, versus the profession were always kind of separate concepts, right? But then what happened is over time they got combined, meaning, if your parents were in a certain profession, you would end up in that profession, etc. And this is what I think has kind of turned into the modern notion of caste, and that led to massive discrimination, especially accelerated during colonial times. Because if you're ruling over people, the best way is to divide them, right? So you find new dimensions to divide them on. And the last name became a marker for caste in India. And so I know a lot of people who can, like just with the last name, guess a whole bunch of detailed information about people. I can't do that, but I know people who can. And so my grandfather was part of a social reform movement where a whole generation of, young idealistic doctors, engineers, whatever, like young educated people, said this is nonsense and, we need to stop this. And so he kind of dropped his last name. And so, it's been 2 generations. We don't have a last name. I still believe in the idealism, so I'm sticking with it. It's a bit annoying sometimes filling up forms or traveling. But hey, if it doesn't hurt, right? Like Luca Delana, I think, who was on your pod and mine, and if it doesn't hurt, then you don't really value it, and so the best way to communicate your values is to bleed a little, right?
I love this story. There's so much to unpack, and I hear you. I told you earlier that I think your life is easier with one name, but then I realized a lot of places will say, "What about your last name?" and they won't let you go until you volunteer something. Anyways, beautiful story. I'm glad you shared it. I think it opened my eyes to something I haven't thought about in a while, but here we are. I want to ask you about the early days. You know that it's coming. Childhood upbringing. I don't know enough. I'd love to hear more. How do you think that time shaped you in your particular interest that you've been pursuing since?
Yeah, it shaped me a lot, actually. So the more I think about my childhood, the more I realize I learned at home on my own and at the dinner table, right? So, and I do give, I give a lot of credit to a few teachers, right, who really kind of, inspired me, opened my eyes, etc. But I would say the bulk of going to school didn't really matter. And I was not, I was I would annoy, I'd get bored very quickly and start annoying, people in the class and get thrown out. So I spent a lot of my childhood outside class. And I joke, if I weren't at an alternative school, I would have probably been a school dropout, right? So I'm very grateful that I didn't get chucked out of school. But yeah, for me, the learning was at home. I grew up with an uncle and aunt, both of whom were teachers. The conversations at the dinner table were about, ranging from, history to kind of, to geography, to politics, to whatever, right, to policy, to a whole bunch of things, philosophy. language, literature, and so it was a very stimulating environment to be in, and like I said, I had the very good fortune of being at a very progressive alternative school that gave me a lot of space to learn my way and to do my stuff, and then I went into a very formal schooling system. So I got a full scholarship from the Jacques Hadamard Mathematics Foundation in Paris to do a master's at the École Normale Supérieure Paris-Saclay, which is a very elite, highly specialized French research institute in math. And so, this is like night and day, right, in terms of the environment. And so highly competitive. All my classmates have been at the top prep schools in Paris. And I come in there and I'm like, I'm totally not I've not been bred for this kind of thing, right? I've not been prepped. I've not, I mean, I tried, but not formally. And so the first year was just, land and survive. That was very hard. But once that happened, then it kind of really, it made me more anti-fragile in many ways, right? And kind of gave me the confidence that, if I jump in and go all in, it works out. And the second year was quite easy. Something very weird in my teenage years was the financial crisis left a big impact on me. I mean, I was a teenager growing up in India. It affected me like zero, right? There was absolutely no reason for me to get so worked up, but somehow, I got obsessed about it. Like I was reading about it, I was trying to understand derivatives. I was reading books. I was trying to understand financial products. Very strange. Anyway, so then for me, it's like, okay, I need to work at a global bank and understand how the machine, how kind of the piping of the financial system, right? If it, how that complex thing works. And so I went to Société Générale, the French corporate investment bank, and I worked on market risk and sort of wrote my master thesis on that and also built a solution for them. And then I worked at an American energy hedge fund trading power. And I remember at the interview, I told the head of trading, look, I don't even know what a megawatt is, right? And I was perhaps exaggerating a little. But his take was, hey, look, you're a smart guy. We want someone who thinks, from first principles, thinks rigorously. And you clearly have that. And so just come on board and you'll figure it out. And, true to his word, I think within 6 weeks, I had my trading exam cleared. And I think I joined, on 2nd November. And before Christmas, I was on my own trading. So, owning the P&L with the team, etc. And then from there, I went to a super... a super South German consulting company, I think now the second largest, but like a very sort of traditional conservative German, consulting environment, which was fascinating for me because I'd only worked in very international companies. But, I grew up sort of French and German, like speaking French and German at home. So linguistically it was okay, but culturally it was, very new. And then, before we go into too much detail, so a whole bunch of experiences like this, doing, what you call step jumps in basketball. So changing sectors and moving up in seniority. So in less than a decade, I was CTO at a real estate technology scale up. And then, did the pivot sort of from growth to profitability. And then the question was, what next? And so then I decided finally to set up my own holding and operating company. And after working 6 months for, Fortune 500 client through friends and a couple of other things, I said, let me sit down, reflect on the last decade of learnings and really kind of, pen down the scars, the pains, the learnings, and also the opportunities that I see in my field. And so that's how Data Impact was born.
So many thoughts come to mind, and I want to pull on many threads, just a handful of them. Speaking French and German at home, that's intriguing. I went to French schools. I have great admiration for French Grande École, the system, and how they take it. And you're right, the students that arrive, high caliber, and you have to step up. I think it was a great motivation for me. And I like the point that you made. It's very subtle, but when you were getting hired, and you bring it up in your book, and it's hard to capture the idea, but it's such an intuitive thing. When you're interacting with somebody, and not necessarily somebody young, but at any point of their career, there are people that will continue to learn and improve. And those that are very good at just showing the knowledge they acquired so far and testing very well. I don't know the best way to describe it, but you want the more dynamic mind I'd love to have, me, myself. And if I'm hiring or... looking for a service provider, because that person will continue to learn and grow with me. right? So you don't have to have the entire vocabulary on day one at 21 when you get the first job. If I can see that somebody can learn and grow, and your book definitely opened my eyes to some things, that's the person I want to talk to, because I can see that if you put them in the right place at the right time, they'll take off. They'll launch to space. I want to ask you the big theme around your book, and I want to dive in. I want to make it more personal. So I'm curious about a personal moment, maybe a failure that showed you that chasing the latest technology trends was actually destroying business value rather than creating it. Let's start there, because I think that's a great foundation for where we want to take this conversation. What triggered it?
I would say it wasn't just one thing, but it was, let's say the moment was when a lot of things coalesced, but all of those things individually are nuggets, of insight that were collected through experience, observation, reading widely, and reflecting, right? And the thing is the following, right, which is that if we look at investing, right, you see very quickly that following the latest trend is not a winning strategy, right? As an investor, if you're just going from one hype or to the other, right? And of course you can ride the wave up, but then who knows when it's going to break, right? And so I think in many ways, if you're playing the long game, then it's, these short-term excitements are irrelevant. I myself graduated during, in 2016, just as DeepMind announced that they had beaten one of the Go masters with AlphaGo, their algorithm. And that was a very exciting moment, because if you think about it mathematically, and I know you play chess too, and I played a lot of chess in high school, obsessively, right? And the thing with chess is, at the end, it's like a decision tree. It's a massive decision tree, but still a decision tree. And so the idea was, look, if we have a lot of compute and good algorithms, this stuff is solvable. And it's true, with Kasparov getting beaten by IBM's Deep Blue, etc. So chess had kind of been solved or conquered in some ways, algorithmically, but Go was considered a lot more, human, a lot more, weird, like not something that you could model in a simple mathematical way. And so having AlphaGo beat the Go master was like a moment where everyone went like, wow, we never thought this would happen that quickly.
Yeah.
And then, for the next 2 years, everyone, AI was just reinforcement learning, right? Which was the core sort of method behind this. And a few years before that, it was deep learning. And then, it became some other variation. And today, if I say AI, what comes to mind is LLMs, right? And so I've seen sort of, just the definition of technology change and evolve so quickly. And so if you're constantly trying to play the technology, you're not playing the game of business, right? Like of the purpose of being there. You're not delighting your customers. And we can look at a whole bunch of other things, right? So it's the same in sports, right? If you're following the latest trend, you're just trying to copy others, you're never going to build your edge, right? It's the same in anything, in art, in whatever you pick, in investing, in across a whole bunch of fields, right? If you want to be great, you need to have a clear vision of what it means to be great, and you have to iterate towards that. And so why should it be different for data-driven value creation? Right. And so it kind of, went to the first principles and said, what is great, right? And how do we iterate towards great? Because clearly following, tech blindly is just spending, right? And no one got rich consuming.
You brought up the concept of riding a wave, and I surf. And I know quite a few investors that surf. Somehow there are long moments of waiting for the wave, and short moments where you really have to pay attention and participate. But each and every wave eventually breaks or fizzles out. And I think that's what you're talking about, how all those new trends, if you're trying just to catch them, a lot of them will fade, fizzle, break. And that's not a recipe for success. I want to zoom in on that. I manage money for families with multi-generational wealth. I'm trying to capture something long-term for them, long-term creation within businesses. And I see legacy businesses that are worth owning. I see newer businesses that are worth owning. The newer ones will become legacy, or maybe they are already. Some of them, who knows? But I'm very curious about this digital transformation that leaders get wrong, and it costs them real money. Can you zoom in on that? they're trying to capture that. And we saw that 25 years ago when everybody had to be .com, although they had physical stores and warehouses, right? And there are other things that everybody has to say, we have AI. and a million things in between in the 20 years of me being in the business. What do they get wrong?
Yeah, it's very funny because I was on Guy Spears' pod and he said, "Oh, why don't we just add .ai to the business and then everything will be fine," right? As a joke.
We tried it. Yeah. Guy has a sense of humor.
Yeah, if only it were that simple, right? That's my point. Yeah. And I think the bigger point I try to make in the book is the following, that it's not about the technology per se, it's about understanding, because what I say is, look, I'm an operator with a decade operating, but I try to look at this as like an investor would, right? So if you take a step back and try to understand what's the point of all of this, right? It's about creating value, right? And this, the tech product management community obsesses about, right? How do we deliver value to the customer, etc., from an operational point of view? And I think the value investing community understands value too, right? It needs to be financial value, on statements that you could read, etc. But then you realize very quickly that you don't have a cost of goods sold when you're building software, right? And neither when you're building algorithms. So you need a new lens, a new way of looking at things. And if you allow me to go take a further step back, I think that helps really get clarity. So what I asked myself was, if the data-driven digital paradigm is a value creation paradigm, what came before, and what characterizes value creation paradigm? Because as a business, as a business owner, as a business leader, I'm an operator, but I want to look at it like an investor. And so if you have to understand the core value creation paradigm and the mechanism, and then you want to find out how you can compound in that value creation paradigm. And so let's take a step back and go as far back as we can in history, right? Now, we started as hunter-gatherers, right, as a species broadly. And so I got curious and I said, okay, everyone's excited about automation. So if I were to quickly ask you a question, if I tell you, let's study hunting, right? What do you picture? What's the first thing that comes to your mind?
Of people, community, and ability to communicate. I'm fascinated with language, so if you get me started talking about it, I'll capture and hijack this conversation. But tell me what you see.
Okay, so you said a bunch of people probably with spears, right, hunting big game, right? That's kind of the first thing that comes to mind. It's very fascinating because what I try to do is I looked for studies and meta-studies of hunter-gatherer communities and try to understand sort of where their how their distribution of calories from the hunt was distributed across different types of hunts, right? And of course, it varies. So firstly, there is no data from 10,000 years ago or 20,000 years ago. So obviously, all of these anthropological studies are on hunter-gatherer communities that still live that life today, right? So if you go to remote parts of the planet, you still have people kind of living that life. And so these anthropologists go and collect that data, they study it, they spend time with them, and then they gather and analyze it. And what comes out of this, and this is obviously a kind of a rough generalization because it varies by season and by location and by whatever, right? But broadly, 40 to 60% of calories from the hunt is through traps, and traps are the first form of automation in some way, right? So if hunting is the value creation paradigm, traps are automation, right? And so if people were just running with spears after big game, the success rates are between 1 and 10%, right? So you would probably go hungry and die out. So which means that 40 to 60% of your calories, meat calories are coming from traps. So you make sure you don't die. And then you have and now there's a variation because there are areas where you have primary predators, right? So if there's a lion, a tiger or whatever, right, wild dogs, there's something else that kills big game or kills game in general. 10 to 20% came from scavenging in those areas, meaning you let the lion kill the buffalo and then you chase the lion away, which is, I wouldn't say it's automation, but it's like arbitrage, or it's like a easy way, it's easy money kind of thing.
Having somebody do the work for you, I think that's the way to put it.
There you go.
Yeah.
right? And it's not really automation, but it's also much easier. And then the groups of people with with heavy weapons killing big game is actually 20-30%, depending on the region and the season. So you realize very quickly, okay, this is a value creation paradigm. If you go about it with let's put in as much effort as possible, you're going to die out, right? So you have to be smart about it. Next, let's move on, right? Let's go to agriculture next. Agriculture, and it's something that Daniel Priestley, says is that land is the form of automation there, right? Meaning, if I give you a seed, you can't make it grow. It's nature's magic, and so you need to put it in. And so the more land, like the per unit of value creation is how much land you have, right? And then we move into the industrial age, and it's about access to raw materials, right? That's how colonization took off in a big way. It's about machinery, it's about factories, it's about feeding that raw material into those factories, right? And labor, of course, as a component of value creation. If you move into the digital paradigm, it's very different because, in the industrial paradigm, replication costs are relatively constant, personalization costs are relatively constant. And so when you move into the digital paradigm, replication costs are essentially zero, right? So like so if you apply that lens of, you just go completely wrong. And then in the data-driven digital paradigm, personalization costs, the decision-making costs in a broader sense, they tend to zero too. And so you really have to rethink the nature of value creation across these paradigms. And for the first time in history, we find ourselves in a place where companies are straddling all three of these, right? So you can be a legacy, shoe company, right? Or a legacy chewing gum company, or, you could be a real estate company. So you're strapped, like all these three paradigms exist. And the industrial paradigm is the oldest one, right? The legacy one where you were born, and hence probably the one that's the most saturated and with the most competition, right? And so if you want to win, it's not about transforming, right? I mean, what are you going to transform into? You're not like some kind of industrial caterpillar that will, metamorphose into a digital butterfly and then you will fly off, right? Like that's the wrong imagery. It's like you have your strengths, your unique unfair advantages through your legacy industrial business. And the question is, how do you kind of understand the data-driven digital value creation paradigm, right? And how do you create how do you craft an offering for your customers, right? Such that you can delight them across these three paradigms and in a unique way. Because if you're just buying, off-the-shelf tech, anyone can do that. And so that gets in a competitive market, that gets commoditized, like that's gone, right? So it's essentially commodity. So technology off the shelf is commodity. So you really need to think from first principles about your strengths and build a value proposition around that. And if you do that, it's both a driver of growth and a moat simultaneously.
Again, so many thoughts. When I think of, I have this image, I saw a photo from the same storefront somewhere in a town. And it really struck me. And I didn't know when it's going to come up, but it came up as I'm listening to you. And the storefront had typewriters written. They sell typewriters. And in the corner of that storefront, it says in little letters, computers. And the photo is from one decade. And there's a photo of the same storefront a decade later. And it says huge computers and a tiny, we still have typewriters. And I don't know if the photo is real, but it made me think of, how it's still a storefront. It's still selling what people want. It's just they want something else. When I think of a legacy business, and I'm reading your book, and I'm thinking how a lot of those businesses build something, a huge moat. And when something new comes, and I'm oversimplifying it, the first idea is, let's just drop this and do something completely different. What you're saying is, with the data that you have and the asset you've built, how do you leverage that? Because you already have a huge advantage. And it's a second chance for a lot of legacy businesses, and we'll talk about some of them as case studies throughout this conversation, to have that second chance. I don't want to miss this, but you pointed out something. First of all, I didn't realize how important the traps were for prehistoric people. It really got me thinking, and it's not going to leave me for a while, this thought. But what I was hearing when I was listening to you, and you brought it up earlier too, there's this idea of figuring out how the world works. You saw the crash of 2008, 2009. You wanted to understand why. There were other things that happened in my life that made me want to understand why. We all have our own why. But there's this saying, the philosopher whose name escapes me in this moment, but I'm sure the audience knows, who said, once you figure out how the world works, the world can do the work for you. I'm sure you know who I'm talking about. I'm forgetting his name. But that's the beauty of it. If you realize that animals fall into holes covered with leaves, you figured out something. Let them keep walking in the dark and falling in your trap. And then you realize that seeds planted in fertile soil will give you tomato and other things. Why not let the soil do the work? And I think it's very simple, but you can extrapolate that to how businesses work these days, and that's where the success lies. We'll come back to it. I do want to talk about your framework. I think it's a great way to introduce this audience to a big picture framework that you talk about. SLASOG. Beautiful name. I'm not going to say what it makes me think of. Tell us what stands behind, and how can we deploy it to generate outsized returns compared to traditional approach to digital transformation?
Yeah. So, I mean, like I said, my first thing is, digital transformation is kind of a myth, and it doesn't make any sense just because, like we're discussing, if you're a very good hunter and I tell you, now let's transform you into a farmer, like it's a completely different value creation paradigm, right? So you don't care about what kind of tools and weapons you have. You care whether you have access to, fertile land, etc. So, I mean, the important thing here is to have a framework that forces you to think rigorously from first principles, right? Mm-hmm. And when I sat down to do that, the first step was save, right? Which is do not do the stupid stuff, right? Do not do the stuff that kind of, in investing terms, do not destroy your capital, right? Because once you wipe that out, it's over. Or do not waste your capital even. Like, you don't have to be wiped out, but like if you waste it, it's just as bad. So the first one is sort of capital preservation, right? And the good thing here is because, what I see every vendor doing in the market, whether they're consultants or, tech vendors, everyone goes out and tells you, oh, you want to digitally transform? Let's spend some money. Let's buy this new tech, right? Let's do this project. And that kind of doesn't the first reaction as a seasoned, investor should be to stop, to think, and not to waste money, right? Mm-hmm. And so save is basically about avoiding, groupthink, which usually is kind of packaged as best practices by every vendor who is trying to sell you some nonsense, right? So don't spend money on that. Take a step back and try to understand, what you so eloquently said, like try to understand the system you're operating in, right? The next step is leverage. So once you have an understanding of your system and you haven't wasted resources, right, then you can find those asymmetric opportunities, those nonlinear opportunities. And there are not too many of them, right? Any investor knows that there are not hundreds of them, right? It's not about how often you trade. In fact, how often you trade is a sign of how poor your performance will be, right? I heard Aswad Damodaran on one of the podcasts, and he was saying, I don't even know what you've traded. If I see the frequency of your trading, I can predict how poor your performance will be. And it's this, and if we apply this to investing, right? And we're investing in companies, so why shouldn't we apply this to decision making within companies, right? Why don't we take a step back and think first? But when you think, look for the asymmetric opportunities, because if it's a linear kind of return, right? You put in $1, you get out $1. That's not going to change your life. It's when you put in $1 and get $100 out, right? That's what you're kind of looking for. And there aren't too many of them. So when you save, take the time to look for these. You need to find one of these, right? 2, at most 3, right? Do those beautifully and understand the logic, right? Validate it. So it's not like you wake up and suddenly go like, oh, wow, I found this one insane asymmetric opportunity. I'll go all in. No, you're going to have a process for sort of constructing a leveraged asymmetric bet, right? Where, you have, and this is something that, I was inspired by Monish Pabra's Dhando Investor, right? So you want to think in terms of these asymmetric bets as an operator. And when you find them, you go all in. And they take time, right? Which brings us to the next step, right? So we did save, we did leverage. The next step is align, right? Because it's not going to happen in a day. It's not going to happen in a quarter. The best things take longer. Why? Because we all understand the power of compounding. You cannot compound in one iteration. You need multiple, as many iterations that you can get, the better, right? And so you want to compound and let compounding do the magic, right? But then you have to do this, and you have to play the longer game. To play the longer game, you need to ensure alignment, because otherwise, you will get distracted, you will move around, you will not be able to take everyone along in your organization, right? And so align is about, once you have found these few leveraged opportunities, right? And leverage not in terms of financial leverage, right? But leverage in terms of, Archimedes, right? So like an 20% effort achieving 80% results in that sense, right? So then you want to align everyone to those. And then once you have that, you need to simplify. And I think this is a very underappreciated aspect of operating, and actually investing for that matter too, which is that in save, you at the outset remove the distraction and sort of, preserve capital. In simplify, you're doing it while going towards your goal, right? So now you've drawn your bullseye with leverage, you've aligned the tip of your spear to that. But if you have clutter flying in all through, right, you won't get the best possible returns. And so you need to actively simplify and kind of clear the path, right? And then you want to optimize, because now there is no clutter, right? You know where you're going. Everything is aligned to that. So now, now you have all your elements of the lemonade. Now make sure you squeeze the lemon as hard as you can, right? Because why not, right? And that allows you to grow. And so, and the grow is super important again, because you might think like, yeah, of course it's for growing. Yeah, but you need to be very intentional about growth, right? And if you're not intentional about growth, then you will end up doing this for other reasons, right? Like for optics, for PR, for vanity, for a whole bunch of other things. While if you focus on your customers, right, and sort of delighting them, that makes sure that you're working towards the right goal.
So much wisdom. I want to pull on a thread or two, if you let me. I have a draft of an article in my drawer that I'll finish one day, and the title is Nonlinear. And you brought up the keyword today, and I'm glad you did. And I've been thinking a lot about it. All the phenomena in our life that are non-linear. We're so used to linear, like 2 + 2, how many eggs you're going to make. And it's very predictable. It's almost like physical. We can see it. And then there are those moments that escape our imagination, the exponential moments. And compounding is obviously a phenomenon. I love the idea of playing an infinite game with the wealth that I'm responsible for, open-ended, multi-generational approach. And compounding as a concept is very hard to grasp for a lot of us, I think including me, but I see what it can do, and it can really move mountains. I'm amazed. But with technology, you brought it up a few times, if you developed a piece of software, if you sell it to the next million people, it costs you hardly anything, right? They download it these days from a website, and it's a piece of code. And when you think about producing it, it's a whole different way of thinking about it, how much it actually costs to produce it and then maintain it, update it, and so on. But there's so many non-linear moments in our life. Even think of this conversation. You and I, in our linear life, are spending an hour together today. But before I wake up, and probably before you wake up on the day when this episode releases, there might be 1,000 people that downloaded this episode and listened to it across the globe in places you and I can't even pronounce the names of. And I know it because I look at the stats and I'm blown away. 150 countries are downloading this episode.
Wow.
I mean, who would have thought, right? That's a non-linear moment where we're translating an hour of our time and a few more hours of reading your book that I really enjoyed to an exponential moment of, 1,000 interactions with people, very intimate interactions, because they take us on a walk and they spend an hour with us instead of talking to their spouse or talking to their kids or, playing with their dog. I have a lot of respect for it. I think it's really humbling to think about it this way. Somebody's giving up an hour to be with you and me today, and I want to thank everybody for listening. I want to ask you about some other stories from your book. Love the framework, by the way. I think it's brilliant. I picked up tennis all over again at this stage of my life, and a lot of my friends have done it too. I don't know what it says about us, but anyways, Roger Federer, you bring him up in the book, and there's something that he said that really, you reminded me of it, it really strikes a chord. But there's a profound difference between winning and losing in tennis and in business. Tell me about that lesson from tennis and how it can be applied in business, managing billions out there.
Yeah, so it's something that got me thinking, which is I think it was at Dartmouth. Federer was invited to give the commencement address, right? So to the graduating class. And he shared this statistic. Then I think for a couple of days it was in the news and everyone was talking about it. But broadly, what he said was that he won around 54% of the balls he played, right? So the individual sort of points. But he won about, or around 80% of the games he played. And what he was trying to get across is, look, you don't have to get every ball right? But if you get the right number of, like if you get the right kind of balls right, on average, right, then you're going to win big time. And so to be clear, right, the tennis point system is nonlinear. So if Federer were playing volleyball or something like that, right? If he got 54% of the points, he would get 54% of the games, roughly. But tennis has a non-linear structure, right, of allocating points. And so what he's basically saying is, look, when you have these non-linear structures, right, these asymmetric ways of winning points, if you get the right points, you can get, it's the same idea of, you put in $1, you get in 100, right? And this got me thinking, and I was like, yeah, this is exactly the kind of mindset I want my reader to have. And so I kind of shared the story in the intro. And it also plays into the idea of leverage, right? And sort of and finding these nonlinear asymmetric opportunities. And once you play a nonlinear asymmetric game, right, and you've understood that game, you will win, right? Then you don't need to do proof of concepts and, some kind of shiny demo, and all that is irrelevant, right? Because once you're really validated empirically that you are in a nonlinear game, that's it, with asymmetric returns, then you want to go all in. And then you want to win it big time.
Well, it's the essence of business and investing. And I think the great eye-opening phenomenon for me is to see how we think of failure and success in very simple terms, right? How, getting a grade at school or missing an answer on a test. I grew up thinking that it's the end of the world until later on when I realized it's not the end of the world. I'm here to learn something, not to prove that I'm a machine. And if anything, actually those incorrect answers taught me more because I zoomed in and I paid more attention to something than getting something right that I just moved over very quickly. That's first. And second, it was a chance to iterate, come up with something different. And that's
if I may riff on this,
Bogumal,
because this is something that I'm really obsessed with right now, because I will, in the fall semester, I'll start teaching the first cohort of LLM-native high school graduates from around the world.
Yeah.
And they're coming into a Bachelor of Engineering, and, the university asked me to, if I could teach math and programming combined. And I said, of course, because logically, why not, right? I mean, why would you separate these disciplines according to historical or whatever kind of ways of thinking? At the end, it's about, building stuff, problem solving, learning stuff, etc. And so the question then for me is, right, if I am teaching the first cohort of LLM native high school students, it's not just that they have access to information with a few clicks like I had in high school with Google search or, with all the other search engines, right? Because at that point you could put in keywords and you got websites, blogs, whatever, right? So you could dive deeper. So which means access to information, or to actually access to sources of information was a click away. The difference with LLMs now is that summarization, connecting ideas, taking a whole bunch of ideas, combining them and writing a short article on them is a click away. And so if I give my students any kind of problem to solve, right, to get them to think, it's useless, because if it's in any textbook or any paper anywhere, it's going to show up. So I have to come up, right, with problems that are completely out of the textbook. Or I ask open-ended questions, right? And so I'm not even telling them what to do. I'm telling them, look, this is broadly the problem. Now you build something, right? So I'm not giving them the specific, I'm not saying, this is the goal. I'm saying this is the direction. you drive, right? Let's see who goes where. And so this is a completely different way of thinking, because if there is no right answer, what will you ask the LLM, right? And so now I unleash your creativity, because if you want to shine, especially if you're competing against other classmates in small teams, right, to sort of get that market dynamic in and that sense of ownership, agency, and competition, then you will, in fact, you using the LLM is a good thing. You using search is a good thing. You speaking to people is a good thing. And so I'm forcing you to be creative, and I'm forcing you to engage with all kinds of knowledge to try to come up with the best thing you can.
Wow. I mean, first of all, I'm very curious how the system, the education that we have, will tackle this fascinating challenge. Because most of my education, I went to schools in Poland and around Europe, and then I came to New York, and the US has been home for 2 decades. But I saw this shift in how I was taught, from absorb the knowledge that's in the book and basically spit it out in a format that's acceptable. And
any LLM will do it better than you today, right? If you give
100%.
it something, it's going to do it way better than you, and better than all of us, right?
And then a handful of teachers, and I liked my physics teacher, I liked my history teacher, I liked my geography teacher, at some point different ones. They got me thinking. They got me inspired. Geography meant see the world. Physics meant understand the world. And history was like learn the context. And it's going to lead up to the next question I have about a certain leader from the past. But anyways, I was thinking how, college, and especially grad school, we were solving some problems. And I liked it so much more because we could come up with different solutions. First of all, that's the reality. Second, what you said, open-ended questions. Most of my life now, whether it's investing work or even the podcast, most of the problems I solve, if you want to use the word, problem here, they're very open-ended. And there's never really one solution. Even when you build a portfolio, there's no one portfolio. Each individual needs something different, and they are going through different phases and changes, and you have to listen to them and feel them and understand them. And they're individuals with their own makeup. There's a person behind a portfolio. There's nothing that's in a textbook that will say, you're 35, you're making this much, this is the portfolio for you. If there's a textbook like this, don't read it. Anyways, I'm fascinated how we're going to go about it. Very briefly, I sat down with somebody a few weeks ago, and their kid is going to college now, and we're talking about, use of AI at school or not, how and that. I found it absolutely fascinating because in 4 years, when they graduate from college, you and I and the whole world will have 4 more years of experience with this new phenomenon that I can't deny that it exists. So I don't think it's safe to tell kids for 4 years you cannot use AI at all.
No.
I don't
use
think it's
everything,
safe.
right? But then just raise the bar, like remove the bar, because the bar was always, this is what we taught you, can you regurgitate it, right? But that's a stupid constraint. Like, why would you play a game with, it's like playing with one hand tied, right? The hand was tied not because we want it tied, it's just because there was no technology to untie the hand. Now it's untied, so play with both hands, or with both legs or whatever, right? That's the game. As a teacher, it's very hard. Like I'm really freaked out, right? I mean, because earlier, right, you were you're kind of the boss. The kids are there to listen to you. You go in, you tell them how the world works, right? That's a very nice patriarchal, situation to be in, because it's, you feel important, you feel comfortable. It's all about your ego. Now it's the complete opposite, because you go in there, you totally exposed. It's but the nice thing is the kids are unchained, meaning they can, there is nothing constraining their creativity, their analytical thinking, their ability to collaborate within their group, their ability to compete amongst the different teams and groups in the class. And so I think it's a mad exciting time. Only if you let them do it, because if you say, oh, you are not allowed to use this, you're not allowed to use that, how is that going to solve anything? Because when they step out on the job market, right, when you're given a problem to solve, a challenge to overcome, no one's going to tell you can't use this or you can't use that. It's about winning in a competitive market. And I want them to understand from the first class onwards, this is about winning, and about winning through learning, through collaboration, and also through competition. All of these things go together.
I think the ability to know where to look for the answer, and even more importantly, the ability to phrase questions. What is it exactly that you're asking? And I think, if anything, my experience with AI so far, on many levels, it's been me really rethinking the way I ask questions, because it has to be very specific, very precise. And I think I even interact with people in a different way. When I explain something to a client, I think the interaction with AI made me rethink and realize the choice of words. And I'm obsessed with words, and I write a lot. I feel like they're so important, and AI is an immediate feedback. You know, a client will tell me in a week they misunderstood something in an email, or they want to follow up to an email. AI will tell you right away, this is not what you were asking for. So I think this immediate feedback loop, I think, teaches me, and I'm sure other people, just to ask better questions to begin with. And this whole podcast is about me being curious and poking the great resource of knowledge that you've accumulated. Anyways, I want to talk about Napoleon, 200 years ago. And he shows up, he's taking the great French nation on a massive war, yet again in Europe. And in your book, he says he won the wars by just marching. He marched through Germany, he marched through Vienna. He also wanted to go all the way to Moscow. There's a certain group thing here, and there's some lessons and some traps in this kind of thinking. History is beautiful because we can look back and see what happened to him. It's not a surprise. We know he didn't succeed for many reasons. But tell me what we can learn from this idea and from groupthink and fighting wars and winning in business, and how does Napoleon teach us the lesson?
Yeah, no, for sure. So the way it started out was, I was kind of looking at the success rates of Napoleon in land battles on the European continent, right? So that's his core. And if you filter out all the battles he fought down to these criteria, I mean, he's just got totally epic hit rates, right? Like he's winning 80 to 100% of everything, every battle he gets into, right? And I'm counting Waterloo, right? And I'm also counting his campaign in Russia, and it was disastrous. A lot of people died, etc. But I mean, to be fair, for the Russians, it was a very Pyrrhic victory, right? I mean, it's not like they won with flying colors or something. They destroyed, they killed their own people, they burnt land, and I mean, that's not a victory, right? In Waterloo, I mean, so what, right? It's one thing, but like the rest of his campaigns is just insane, like how successful he is. And what I wanted to understand is how does he achieve these rates, right? Before we get into that, just to riff on what kind of talent he was and how he came up, I think France was in such chaos that with his capabilities, his drive, and also his sort of, I guess, hunger for power, but also vision for what France could achieve, I think he kind of rose to power very quickly and very opportunistically, given the chaos of those times. And if you look at his marshals, right, he's drawing them from all kinds of background. I mean, he had a Polish marshal, right? So he's got people from because he himself was a Corsican refugee, right? So he worked his way up and he made sure he got the best people on his team. But apart from that, I think if you see how he goes about every battle, so he arrives, before the battle starts, he understands the battleground. He thinks through what his opponents might do. So he's thinking from first principles about the entire system of the battlefield in which he's operating, right? And he's looking for these, this non-linearity, these asymmetries, these unique unfair advantages, etc. And so he's looking for those. And then when the battle actually happens, it's like he just destroys them because they're busy in their own sort of usual best practices and mechanisms of doing things, and they're not looking at every battle as a separate opportunity to do something amazing and to win. And the funny thing is, a lot of these guys are nobility or well connected, well off, whatever. And the Prussians and the Austrians and the Russians, they keep sending the same buffoons back on the battlefield, and they keep getting beaten. And so part of Napoleon's success is his genius of and his effort of treating each battle as an opportunity, thinking from first principles, being system aware and all of that. And the other part is just the opponent sending the same idiot on the battlefield, right? So you have to also give him, he was also lucky in some ways, because had his opponents been smarter, it would have been different. And the interesting thing is, post the Napoleonic era, the Prussians actually did a complete revamp of their military, right? And they tried to understand the French method. And I think that leads me to one of the key things I think that Napoleon pioneered, which is commander's intent. So his approach to warfare, right, once he had a picture of the game he was playing and how he wanted to win that game, was to ensure every person, right, in his army understood that. And the way, and so he wouldn't give you commands, typically like the Prussians at that time or the Austrians or the Russians did. So it wasn't a fixed set of tactics, a fixed set of instructions, or in today's corporate speak, it wasn't a bunch of tasks to be executed, right? What he was communicating was intent. So he was saying, look, this is our goal, and these are the constraints within which we're operating and all of that. And so he would communicate that to all his troops through a very interesting mechanism. So he made sure that on his general staff, he had an old, illiterate foot soldier. And all three adjectives are important, because old, because, the person might not be the most open-minded or, creative or new to thinking and curious, right? Illiterate, because they can't read orders, right? So on a battlefield, you cannot say, oh, give me a second, I need to have my teams read this. It's not like at Amazon where Jeff Bezos made everyone read a document before a meeting, because here you have bullets flying around, right? So it's the same idea, but it has to be verbal. And thirdly, a foot soldier, because every person needs to understand it's not just for the generals, it's not just for the officers. And every order would be first read out to this guy, and if this guy nodded, and then Napoleon would ensure he explained it back, and he explained it back the way Napoleon wanted him to understand it, only then would this order go out, would that order be ready for the battlefield. Otherwise, it would be rewritten. And so I think alignment through this idea of intent is so important. And then, like I said, after the Napoleonic times, it's something I learned recently after publishing the book, is that the Prussians reformed their army with the same approach, right? And so this is now a global phenomenon, right? No one on the battlefield gives you a set of tasks or orders. Everyone is leading with intent. And such a powerful way, and if the militaries around the world can do it, they're the largest organizations at an insane scale and with very high stakes. Why don't you use it too, right, to align your teams within your company?
I mean, that's so true and so obvious, but at the same time, I think very few people still apply it at a business level. And that leads me to another question related to that. You talk about the North Star, how there's one single metric, right? So we have the single intent, but then there's one single metric that actually drives long-term value creation for any particular business. Can you talk about this idea? You have the intent, and then you have one metric. You're simplifying it to the point that it's almost painful how honest it is, but it's so true. Can you talk about it?
Yeah, so I mean, the idea of the North Star metric was developed by Sean Ellis, right, in the context of software startups, and also Alistair Kroll and Ben Yoskowitz in their book Lean Analytics, they called it the one metric that matters. And the most important thing to understand is, again, value creation paradigms, right? So in the industrial paradigm, you can, you have your revenue, you subtract your cost, and that's your profit, etc., right? So everyone's EBIT focused. If you look at a traditional good business operator in the industrial paradigm, they're all EBIT obsessed. So, you don't need any other metric, because EBIT is, also what you take home, right, at the end of the day in your bank account. So when you go into software, like I said, you don't have this cost of goods sold kind of, it doesn't make any sense, because again, it's infinitely replicable, right? So you need some kind of quantification of value delivered to the customer, right? Because what you want to do is align all your efforts to that, because at the end of the day, that's how you make money. And then the cost, etc., is something you manage separately, right? But the North Star metric was born in the digital paradigm, in the software paradigm, to align, especially startups at that time, because it's starting from zero, right, towards something. Now, why is this important, right? Especially for, in terms of winning. If you look at the battlefield, right, the North Star metric is intrinsic, which is winning the battle, because everything else is useless if you don't win the battle. If you look at sports, right, I don't know, football, soccer, whatever you call it, right, basketball, all these, in any sport you pick, the North Star metric is clear. You want to win the game, right? There's no questions about this. And so when you're working so in business, it's a bit more nuanced, right? So, I mean, you can have variations, you need to sit down and you need to think this through. And it's the process of thinking about it that also helps achieve alignment, right? And helps achieve a sense of common purpose, right? The process itself. But the outcome, right? The North Star metric, then post that is super useful, because now, if you combine that with commander's intent, you can scale that sense of focus and alignment and also togetherness within the team towards the goal. And if you do that, you can compound. And the advantage of the North Star metric is not something you need to reinvent every day. So it's not a to-do list, right? Because if you have a to-do list, the moment you complete those tasks, you're looking for the next set of tasks to do. And there is a discontinuity between them, right? So the thing with alignment is you want continuity and you want it long-term so that compounding can do its magic. And so I think North Star metric with commander's intent is a brilliant way to align in any organization.
So much to unpack. I'll leave it at that. I love both ideas, and I think they simplify at the end of the day, especially if you're managing 10,000 people, and some of the companies whose shares I end up owning, they have 10,000, 50,000 employees. I always wonder, how do you get that intent all the way across with that foot soldier all the way? And then what are you guys looking at? It's not earnings per share. What are you guys actually paying attention to?
And this is super important, right? Because you said you invest across businesses, right? Legacy, new, etc. The important thing is EBIT is a backward-looking metric, right? So EBIT tells you what happened. EBIT is not a forward-looking metric. If you want to move fast and if you want to be adaptable, you need a leading metric, not a lagging metric, right? And so that's why the North Star metric is important. And it cannot be EBIT, right? The problem is a lot of people have the right intentions, are looking for these non-linearities, and then they mess it up because they take EBIT as their guiding metric, as their North Star metric, and then it doesn't matter how smart you were before that, which asymmetric nonlinear opportunities you found. If you use the wrong North Star metric, you're going to run against the wall, right? Because you're orienting your compass is broken and your sense of direction is gone.
To be future oriented, which brings me to a concept you bring up in your book. It's called unpredictable uncertainty. And I've written a lot about risk and uncertainty. I love the concepts because they mean different things to different people. You talk about predictable uncertainty, but what is unpredictable uncertainty, why it matters, and how business leaders can adapt their decision-making and take that into account?
So the idea is the following, is that you need a certain level of system awareness, right? So because the way you act should be dictated by the system you're in. And a common guest we've had, Cadalana speaks about it in his, he calls it the game, and you need to understand the rules of the game. And so broadly, mathematically or, kind of more science, physics kind of way of thinking about this is understanding the system. And there's a Sinefin framework, which I kind of quote and refer to in the book. And the idea is broadly to classify the environment you're operating in. So is this an environment where you understand causality? So if I do this, then this happens, right? That's the best case, right? That's where you know everything. And in that case, you can optimize all in, right? Because you understand how the environment reacts based on what you do. There are situations where you don't fully understand that, right? That's a more uncertain environment. And the question is, how do you go about operating then? And then, you have, I think, what we call sort of unknown unknowns in finance, right? So that's you don't even know what you don't know, right? So the first thing is to know. The second thing is to know that you don't know. And the worst kind of, or the most, let's say the most adversarial environment is one where you don't know what you know, right? And so the way you go about thinking how you operate has to be dramatically different across these three. And there is no continuity, right? Meaning you need to be very clear in your head what environment you're in, because your entire strategy, your approach in operating has to be designed to that. And if the environment evolves, right, and changes, you want to have mechanisms to detect that in as empirical a way as possible, right? So that you can rethink how you approach it. Because if you don't do that, you will drive against the wall.
I often think about the downside. And there's another draft of an article in my drawer where I want to explain how I look at it. And the more I look at it, I see that it's multidimensional, to say the least. And to me, when you say when anybody asks me, would you take that risk? I'm thinking, can I afford the downside? Like if I'm absolutely wrong, I often say I want to be the least wrong, which Roger Federer's thinking applies to what I want to do is I want to be the least wrong. I don't have to be right 99% of the time. I don't think it's possible. But if I am wrong about whatever, even telling you it's not going to rain today, if I'm wrong about what I just said, what are the consequences? What's the worst that can happen, right? I'm going to get wet because I didn't take an umbrella. I might be late to a lunch appointment, whatever else, right? I can afford those risks. So that's one way of looking at it. And for me, it's how long do I have to pay for the consequences? I'm going to come home, take a shower, change my shirt. End of story, case closed. Now, if I trip and fall, break a leg, I'm out for a couple of weeks. I'm going to miss my tennis. I'm going to miss a lot of appointments. I'm going to have to cancel a flight I have, right? And I might be in some sort of physical rehab for a while, therapy. So I might be losing a month or two of my 100% ability to participate in life, right? So I'm thinking about the consequences. And there are some consequences you're going to be paying for the rest of your life. On the flip side, and I don't want to hijack this conversation, but there's some rewards and the nonlinear part kicks in. Not only the effort initially is not that big, Manish Babrai, but it can pay off for the rest of your life.
Correct.
These are the things we want to pursue. Anyways.
Yeah, and I think to kind of keep both in mind while thinking is super important because you don't want to just focus only on the downside or the upside. And so, I mean, what I argue in the optimized step is really look at the entire distribution of outcomes and then try to, have a downside cover, sort of hedge yourself on the downside and then optimize the upside. Right, that's the game, and you need to look at the entire set of outcomes. And I think what is very unfortunate in a lot of legacy businesses is people are obsessed with point forecasts. Right, so tell me what will be my revenue number, I don't know, in 3 months, in 6 months, in a year, in 3 years, whatever. Right, and or like how many units of a product will I sell? And the case I make is if you think like that, right, the forecast is simplistic, meaning it gives you a number. In a slightly more general sense, you might get some kind of interval, right? But unless you think about the distribution of outcomes and their probabilities, right, you cannot optimize your decision to the max. If you have a distribution of probabilities for all future outcomes, now suddenly you can start thinking about, associated costs with each of these. So you can hedge your decisions, right? You can maximize out. You can basically construct these asymmetric sort of leveraged, upside, main upside only kind of bets. And most people don't do that, and it's so unfortunate because as investors, once you understand this, you cannot unthink it. But somehow as operators, we put wool over our eyes, and then we're like, oh no, tell me the units sold next month. Like, how is that even useful, right? Because you cannot make any decision based on that.
That's what moves the stocks, at least in the short term. Missing guidance, missing earnings, and people are so focused on the wrong thing. But let them do that because it creates opportunities for you and I to participate and buy and many others when the market gets spooked. I'm immediately thinking of Chris Mayer, 100 Beggars. He's been on the show multiple times. He does incredible work explaining his thinking, open-ended long-term opportunities. Luca Delana has been on the show 3 times. I was introduced to Luca by Guy Spear, who's a good friend who featured your work as well. I just wanted to mention them. And Luca's books are incredible, just as yours. Luca's thinking about risk, the games we play, and he explains it in a way that I can't even. But truth be told, our life is lived in a more dynamic way. And some decisions might feel at the time that they lead to an outcome we don't want. But over the long run, the outcome might be more positive. So a business, failure, a product launch that didn't work out has taught a lot of businesses more than immediately successful. Going back to what we talked about at the beginning, I don't know how to explain and capture it. It will be in an article at some point, but I thought about it a lot. Even a decision not to buy something that will lead to you not losing money on an idea, and that money can be deployed in another idea. It's a multi-layered investment decision. It has long-term consequences. So I always say it's not just the money that you made, but also the money you chose not to lose.
Yeah, the opportunity costs, right? Everyone focuses on the explicit sort of, direct costs, but
yeah, what are you missing? I could keep going. I have 1,000 more questions, but for today, I have one last question for you, RItavan. I want to ask you about your definition of success. How do you think about success?
Yeah, well, I think of it like a frame of mind, honestly, because I can't think of it in a static way. And so for me, it's really just the ability to keep learning and growing in the broadest sense. I think that's sort of, if I had to capture it in a sentence. But also what comes to mind and what I'm sort of trying to live by more is something Guy Spear told me when I was in his podcast, and something that really opened my eyes. And he said, he's in a phase in his life where he's trying, like, sort of his North Star metric is really creating stories, like positive, happy stories for people, right? So basically sort of increasing happiness with the people he interacts with. Mm-hmm. And for me, in a very direct way, from after that conversation, my reaction was, if he's doing it at his age, right, why don't I start doing it now in whatever way, right? I'm not, I think at every stage in life, you can do more and you can do differently. But something I try to do more of is just be more aware of that. It's like, my footprint on the people and everyone else I interact with, and try to do as much good as possible and sort of, create happy, good stories for people. I think that's a beautiful thing that compounds over time.
Compounding of goodwill. And Guy Spear has done a lot for a lot of people. And
he's incredible. Yeah.
A remarkable thing about him is that he will take your book, send it to someone, not tell you that he did. And then out of the blue, somebody approaches you at an event and says, I read your book. Guy Spear sent me your book. And I didn't know. I'm sure it will happen to you. I know it happened to many other people. He does things.
It is actually a crazy story, right? So pre-launch, I mean, I read The Education of a Value Investor half a dozen years or so ago, and it kind of really, and along with Richer, Wiser, Happier, and Monish Pabrai's book, The Hundo Investor, and all of that, and it really changed the way I approached work, but also my personal life and everything, my life philosophy basically. And so when I got the first 10 author copies of my book, my first reaction was to send it to people I was grateful to. And, I wanted to send one because, Monish is in the US. I don't even know his address. I don't know how to reach him. But then I found Guy's address online. And Zurich is not far from Munich, where I live in southern Germany. And so, I sent him one by post. And my wife said, oh, it's good you did it. It's nice, but you're never going to hear from him. And in 5 days, I get a handwritten note from him saying, I really enjoyed your book and all of that. And was like, wow. And it's not even been launched. And then I get an email from his chief of staff, Chantal, who's, very kindly tells me, can you send a dozen copies over? And I was like, okay, sure. It's not available to buy on Amazon yet. So I packed a dozen copies. I sent them over. And the next thing I find out is that they were, at value X BRK, right? So at the historic Berkshire Hathaway meeting pre-launch, I wasn't there, but a dozen copies of my book were there. And so that was really a special, magical thing that happened.
Chantal is a wonderful person, and the whole team, really good people and doing good things. I like this idea, and we could pull on this thread forever, but doing the right thing, even if nobody's watching, or climbing the mountain, even if you can't tell anybody you did, there's a powerful revelation behind it, and kindness and goodwill. If you do something, and obviously out of kindness of your heart, you don't expect anything in return, and you don't tell anybody.
Exactly.
I don't know. There's something magical about it.
There's something beautiful about it. Yeah.
And the impact is nonlinear. One last thought. Last week, an upcoming guest told me something, and I'll leave it for the episode, but she told me that she wants to benefit the most people in her life. And I thought, what a beautiful goal to have, And, the writing that you do, or the podcast, and you make yourself available even for this conversation, you're benefiting a lot of people. I don't know. There's something that gets me out of bed and gets me excited for this conversation, many others, that if this 1 hour of you and I talking about something benefits one single person somewhere or puts a smile on their face, it made my day. On that 100%. Note, RItavan, thank you so much for today. This was incredible. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Bogumil. I really loved it. And thanks a lot for having me on your show.
You You were listening to Talking Billions. We talk about big ideas, big inspirations, big topics. We take on the hardest subject of all, money. But our conversations lead us to an even bigger question: what it means to live a rich life beyond money. If you enjoyed the show, please take a moment and follow, subscribe, rate, and share with friends and family. We rely on word of mouth to promote the show. One click for you means the world to us. Thank you. Until next time, your host, Bogumil Baranowski.